I want to connect or start off, I think, where Mr. Omogo left off essentially. I really appreciate today's presentation. I think especially bringing C1 and ICPAC here together is showing us exactly the right approach of dealing with climate change, conflict, and insecurity in this space. But Mr. Omogo raised carefully that climate change is increasing the risk of conflict. And I think that is something we should always keep in mind. It is not a sole trigger of conflicts, but it is a risk factor. And if you pay attention to his presentation, most of the issues he raised that are contributing, that are security issues here, are actually human security issues. That is why CPRI, among others, and I think that is something we see moving or catching on more broadly, is actually not speaking about threat multiplier anymore in relation to climate change and the security implications. What we talk about is climate-related security risks. Why do we do that? And that has partially to do with the dynamics we see in relation to conflicts, but it also has to do very much with the policy processes and thinking about the interventions that are possible. Threat multiplier is something that gets us all hyped up, and we see the point that we need to do something, but when it actually comes down to it, human security issues are not threats. They are related to livelihoods, to everyday dynamics. So finding an approach that is more centered around human security, livelihood issues, that is inclusive of the local dynamics, I think is something really important. I'm going to speak about climate risks, human security, and the peace-building process, and I specifically will focus on the peace-building process, I think, in my remarks. And that is also something that Mr. Omogo mentioned when he overlaid the ACLED data or brought in the ACLED data for the region. What we did in a paper last year was to actually look at the number of peace operations personnel. That means how many staff members of the biggest peace operations, how many are there, and how does that overlay with exposure to climate change and climate security. And what you see in the table is essentially a list of the 10 biggest peace operations. That is the 10 peace operations or countries that are hosting the most peace operations staff. And as you see, 8 out of the 10 are in areas highly exposed to climate change. That doesn't mean that climate change has anything to do with the conflict. But it is an interesting starting point to start thinking about a different question. What does climate change actually mean for our peace-building processes? Right? What is happening in these situations, which led to us, which led us to follow up with a more in-depth study to trying to understand really, aside from the impacts we see on the ground, what is climate change actually doing to these peace processes? As a first study, we looked at Somalia with a specific focus on UNSOM in that time to ask 2 questions. How is climate and climate-related environmental change in Somalia and the Horn of Africa hindering the successful implementation of UNSOM's mandate? And actually, what did the mission do? How has UNSOM integrated the challenges stemming from climate-related environmental change into its ongoing operations? One thing that surprised us was the number of different pathways that climate change is impacting the peace-building process in Somalia. And specifically, we can expand that to the whole peace-building process, but especially the work of UNSOM in this space. You see the mechanisms here. I strongly recommend you, if you have an interest, to look into the publication to read more on that. I won't have time to go through them, but I want to focus on one specifically, which is the legitimacy of the Somali state building process that is undermined, which again relates back to something that was mentioned already. Climate impacts as well as conflict are displacing people. People move. the interesting dynamic from a researcher perspective, interesting dynamics that we see in Somalia is, for example, visible in the city of Baidoa. The influx of displaced people, both caused by the conflict, but also through displacement, through floods, as well as droughts, has actually led to a change in the demographic composition of the city. Now that alone is not a problem in itself, but if you take then the backdrop, what UNSOM and what the peace building process in the city looked like, we had a lot of local peace agreements that might not be the big peace agreements we often talk about, but of course there are a lot of small-scale governance arrangements and peace agreements in place. And in the city of Baidoa, this was along clan lines to give a power sharing agreement to give everyone their fair share. The problem was the influx of displaced people completely changed the composition, the demographic composition of the town, which makes the power sharing agreement essentially obsolete. And I think that is a challenge, especially when we look at the peace building side of things. That is a challenge that is not really acknowledged and taken into account in a lot of these processes. So the question is essentially, what do we do about that? And I could tell you now the recommendations of our report, but I actually wanted to take recommendations from another process that I had the privilege to be involved in, and I think that match very well, A, with the region, and B, with what is needed, and specifically the example of the risk to peace agreements. Together with Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Kenya and the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, we had the privilege to host a series of workshops the last 2 years with bringing together regional experts in the Horn, experts and civil society actors, to get a different perspective on climate security, get a regional civil society perspective on, and learn in the process what is valuable. And the result of that is summarized in this report, Climate Security in the Horn of Africa, Perspectives on Addressing Climate-Related Security Risks from the Horn, which I think is a really interesting process because it brings a different perspective into the discussions, especially also on the international level. But what we saw play out in this group and in the discussions in this group is exactly also the point how climate change is impacting local agreements, how it's affecting peace agreements on a local level, and resulting in the question, what do we do about that? So the group came up with essentially 4 criteria. And the first, obviously now at this point probably, is peace processes and peace agreements need to be more climate sensitive. So that means we need to learn much more about these dynamics and how they are impacting processes, how it's affecting mediation processes, or as Mr. Omogo also mentioned, how can we bring climate or environmental indicators into our early warning works, but I'll come back to that. The second criteria is the need to involve local communities. And I think that is absolutely crucial. As we saw, the impacts are on the local level. They are human security and livelihood issues, and they need to bring the local communities into these discussions, which are both suffering at the front of this double burden between climate change and conflict. We need to bring them into the benefit on the national and regional peace process, but of course also on the local level. I think the presentation before me essentially confirmed, but also showed that there is a sound foundation on regionally and locally owned knowledge and data analysis. And I think CWARN and ICPAC are at the front of this and are a critical actor to provide this type of information and on the ground in this specific region. But then moving into criteria 4, that also relates to the broader regional processes, to the African Union not only the early warning work and this coordination in helping to build this capacity and further learn from each other on these processes, but actually also international actors like the UN, which is very present in Somalia and is involved in the peace building process. Those need this engagement with the regional actors, the regional processes and mechanisms that we see within the African Union and within IGAD. But of course, also then find ways to actively involve civil society in this space. I will end it there. I thank you for inviting me. I hope that I could provoke some thinking about this issue of climate risk, human security, and the peace building processes. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.